Hi, everybody. While we're waiting, feel free to say hi in the chat. It's nice to see you. Tell us where you're signing on from. And we'd love for you today to use the question section if you have any questions for our presenters. I'll be keeping track of those. And I think with that, we'll get started. So thank you for signing on for our panel. I really wish I could see all of your faces today. I have been to many parent representation conferences through the ABA in person, and today I am definitely missing my friends and colleagues. I'm Jill Cohen, social worker and the director of programs for the Office of Respondent and Parent Counsel in Colorado. We provide oversight, training, consultation, and we pay the lawyers, social workers, and parent advocates who represent poor families with child welfare cases in Colorado. So Colorado is a relatively new addition to the parent defense scene. Our agency just formed in 2016. Before 2016, here in Colorado, and maybe this is your state's story too, it was just a free-for-all with some random list of lawyers who were willing to represent parents if a judge called them up and asked them personally. For some context, in Colorado, our defense team members are independent contractors. We have recently been able to draw down on federal Title IV-E funding to pay for our social workers and parent advocates and to develop a pre-petition legal services program. I'm very familiar with the interdisciplinary law office model, where lawyers and other advocates like social workers and peer advocates are employees who work closely together on the teams, because I did also work in New York City at the Center for Family Representation before moving here about 6 years ago. I'm just sharing that because I know our audience is diverse and we want to reach as many defenders as possible. I'm really glad to have been able to experience both types of defense work in terms of models. Contractor versus employee, they have their pros and cons, but overall, I'm really impressed with how our colleagues across the country have found resources and done the really hard work of convincing legislators, big institutions, and courts that high-quality parent representation with access to advocates for parents is really worth fighting for. So no matter what model you are able to make work, thank you for doing your best. No matter our struggles to enhance the way parents are represented, I see all of us finding each other. We find each other in trainings, on listservs, through Mimi and the ABA. And one really impressive thing about our growing parent defense community is that I find our colleagues to be really generous with their time and support. So if you're still growing, ask for help. I'm also here to say that it can feel like some other state or some other agency is doing it better, or they have more resources, or maybe their child welfare agency is more amenable to working with you. But we're all facing the same institutional problems: racism, punishment of poor people, ambiguous talk about things that mean nothing, like best interests, and the poor treatment of parents and their children. So our battles for parents' rights and due process and humanity bring us together. In assembling this panel, my strong inclination was to share information on how to inspire lawyers and advocates on defense teams to bring teamwork to the next level. It's part of my job at the ORPC in Colorado, and I have definitely struggled to articulate this really consistently. Of course, what next level looks like is going to be different for everyone here today. It's 2021, and even with COVID and insane politics, we have more states with well-trained and passionate parent defenders than ever, and it's really inspiring. But parent defender agencies across the country are in different stages of development. We have states with really experienced models, like in New York, Washington State, California, and we have newcomers who are just assembling and getting their defense team started, like in South Carolina and Oklahoma. And I know at least Idaho and DC, their parent defense teams are still just a hypothetical. In order to ensure that our discussion today resonates with as many of you as possible, no matter your role, no matter your state's model of representation, or how long you've been doing the work, we ask our panelists today to focus on what they're really good at. We ask them to share how they engage in strategy discussions and how they figure out roles among their interdisciplinary defense team members. Our first presenters, Maggie and Jess, are super experienced and skilled at high-level communication, and they'll be focusing on how they tackle parent defense on medically complex cases in the Bronx. Listen closely to how they trust each other and depend on each other to get the work right for parents. I bet they would both say they couldn't do it alone. Lisa from Boston is our second presenter and will focus on her defense social work role when those strategy discussions lead to talk about retaining an expert. And even if you don't have access to resources for experts yet, I encourage you to listen anyway. Sometimes you find experts who are dedicated to this work, and sometimes they're hiding in the background of your cases. Lisa will talk you through her process. And finally, Sonja from Washington State, who is an expert, because in order to execute all of these team strategy discussions, we need to know how to get our experts to blow everyone away when they're on the stand, if they make it that far. Sonja will give us insight into what experts need to be informed and prepared. And when you work in defense, we all know, you do not get a lot of chances to tell your client's story in court. So you want to be prepared and you want your expert to be rock solid. This work can involve the whole defense team, not just the lawyer. Some of what you hear will reflect your current practices, making space for ongoing team communication, trusting your teammates, sharing responsibilities on difficult cases, seeking feedback, being intentional. And some of what you hear today may feel for you more aspirational, especially if your jurisdiction has only just begun to build teams, or if you lack access to social workers or peer advocates or money for experts. All of that is okay, and you're in the right place. We'll make time for questions and discussion so that we can learn from each other. I have been a member of many defense teams in 2 states, and I can tell you that just organizing the panel and talking to the panelists have taught me new tricks that I'd like to bring back to my Colorado parent defenders. So just when I think I know a lot, I'm reminded that I have a lot to learn. So please remember the ABA conference guidelines. Feel free to put comments that you have or hellos in the chat. And then please use the question box in order to ask questions for the panelists. I'm pretty sure that you can even vote on which questions you would like to be prioritized for us. I'm going to let each of our panelists introduce themselves further. And so now I'm going to pass it over to Maggie and Jess, a lawyer social worker duo from the Bronx Defenders.
Hi, everybody. My name is Maggie, and I am a social work supervisor over at the Bronx Defenders Office. Family defense practice. I work alongside Jess. Jess and I have experience working on several medically complex cases throughout the years, and usually I'm the go-to, she's the go-to.
I'm trying to share my screen. Can you all see it? Great. I'm Jessica Horan Black. I am a supervising attorney at the Bronx Defenders. In September, I'll have been there 10 years, and I supervise our medically complex cases. And I'm going to talk about what that is in a minute. And I work very closely with Maggie on many of my cases. Thank God. So we're going to talk about a little bit, we're going to talk about for about 15, 20 minutes about how we work together to achieve outcomes for our clients. So
Okay, so advocates and attorneys are what make up the dream team, what I call it here at Bronx Defenders. They make up the legal team that's going to represent our client. So social workers and parent advocates are invaluable when it comes to these medically complex cases. It's very important that the team works as closely as possible, meaning that there is a group chat with the client started, that there is a text chain between the attorney and the advocate going, that the advocate and the attorney are sharing emails that is in regards to the case, any emails that is constant communication between and transparency between the attorney and the advocate. And I think that, oh, and taking really good notes and sharing notes with each other, whether it's coming up with like a shared drive or something. So yeah, those are the things that I think we focus here at the Bronx Defenders when it comes to when we get these medically complex cases.
So yeah, so when Maggie and I first meet a client or any social worker at Bronx Defenders, and sometimes we have parent advocates that work on the case, we'll say advocates, and our medically complex cases often have social workers. We present ourselves as the legal team, right? All of the confidentiality, all of the privilege extends to Maggie or whoever the social worker is on our cases. Very often our clients have negative connotations with social workers or attorneys, but often social workers they've worked with. So Maggie's very clear about what her role is, which is to represent the client in their wishes, and we introduce them as such. So we work very closely together, and we're going to talk about how Maggie or any social worker is a critical member of the trial team in terms of legal strategy and theory. Just to tell you what we're going to discuss real quick, we're going to explain what a medically complex case. We're going to talk about one case that we're working on right now, and we're going to go through the ways we work together by talking about a particular case, and then talk a little bit about the best practices Maggie and I have realized as we've worked together over the last few years on multiple cases. The PowerPoint. Is the PowerPoint moving for you guys? No.
It's still on the agenda.
Okay.
Your PDF?
Yeah, it's saying it's moving, sorry. But it's
Okay.
not actually moving. I can try to unshare and share. I apologize, folks.
That's okay. It's a new platform.
But I can just explain. I'm going to stop sharing.
It looked like at the end it moved.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so I'll try again. And if not, I'll just move on. Or I don't know, Jill, if you can.
I think at the end it was working, Jess, so I think if you share it again, it will work. And if not, then I'll do it for you.
Okay, thanks. I'll just answer one question while I'm sharing, which is that these teams do not exist in only in medically complex cases. They exist in pretty much all of our cases where we deem it's necessary. We don't have resources to help for everyone, but all of our medically complex cases have a social worker. I'm just going to keep going and hope that it loads, if that's okay. Or you can try, Jill, but it's sticking in.
It's really great. Don't apologize. It looks good, and it's
okay.
It's fine. Thank you.
Okay, so our medically complex cases, just so y'all know, are cases where there are cases where you have some sort of broken bone or some sort of allegation of physical abuse. I call them medically complex because I used to call them physical abuse cases. My coworker at Brooklyn Defenders was using medically complex, and it spoke to me because a lot of times I don't want to assume physical abuse occurs, right? Oftentimes it's a medical issue. By saying physical abuse, you're acknowledging that maybe their charges have some value when very often they don't. And obviously I've given presentations before at the ABA about medically complex cases, and I'm happy to help on any of those cases for individuals on the call. But today, obviously, we're focusing on my collaboration and our collaboration with Maggie. But those are cases where there's fractures with, quote, without an explanation, abusive head trauma without an explanation, burns, bad bruising, anything that would fall under the umbrella of sort of physical abuse allegations, because that's what I specialize in now. And Maggie, frankly, does too, as well, because she's done so many cases with me. So we're going to talk about the critical areas of our collaboration. Hopefully my PowerPoint will catch up with me. Developing a little legal strategy, our litigation investigation, our hearing prep and out-of-court advocacy, which is really Maggie's bread and butter. So we're going to go through a case example as we talk about how we work together.
So as Jess mentioned earlier, this is like a case that we're currently working on. We have a client, we'll name him Mr. A. Mr. A is a 19-year-old first-time father. He's not in a relationship with his child's mother, but they co-parent very well. The daughter is a beautiful 6 weeks old. So there was one weekend, he usually takes his daughter on the weekends, and there was one particular weekend where the daughter came over and she appeared to be sick. She was a little fuzzy. The baby then was showing symptoms of having a very hard time with breathing. So the mother called 911, and the dad started performing CPR on the baby's chest while they waited for the ambulance to arrive. When they arrived to the hospital, the baby was diagnosed with pneumonia, and when they did the x-ray, they discovered that there were 3 rib fractures. ACS was immediately called, and the parents were interviewed, and the parents didn't have an explanation for that fracture that was noticed on the x-ray. So the baby was immediately removed. She had to stay at the hospital to treat the pneumonia and the fractures. And ACS filed what is called an abuse case in Bronx Family Court.
Okay, so since I specialize in those cases, I got a phone call. Then my second phone call was to Maggie, because I knew how critical it is to have a social worker on the case from the beginning. One of the things we're going to talk about is, Maggie, I don't know if you can mute yourself.
Oh, sorry.
Oh. One thing we're going to talk about is how critical it is to have a social worker involved in every single aspect of the litigation from the beginning to the end, so they can have a full picture of what's happening if possible. So what do when I get a petition, I call the social worker. In this case, it's Maggie. The social worker and the attorney speak to the client together, and together with the client, and of course separately, we develop the legal strategy and litigation for the case, right? It's not me alone if I have Maggie there, right? She is a critical member, not just from an ideas standpoint, but she has hopefully talked to the client with me, and we can work together to figure out what is our legal strategy here and what is our theory of litigation. By theory of litigation, I mean, how are we going to accomplish what we want to accomplish? How are we going to accomplish our legal strategy? Usually that's through storytelling, right? And persuading a judge, right? But in this case, Maggie's a critical member of that. So I am including her in every aspect of the litigation, right? Every court appearance she can go to, I want her there. Every conference she can go to. I'm forwarding her emails if it's appropriate that I've had between legal and myself, so she can see what's going on. BCCing her where it's appropriate. CCing her. I want her in every meeting. I have, with medically complex cases, I often meet with experts, right? I want her in the meetings with the experts. I want her to review the medical records. Her contribution is critical. And in order for her, and we're going to talk about this when she goes out to investigate and help me investigate, in order for her to be able to do that effectively, she needs to know as much as I know. And so I think the way to do that is to just include that person in every single aspect of the litigation.
And to Jess's point, why is it so important to include a social worker immediately? Because it is a very critical time, and like time is of the essence. So when Jess calls me, I know immediately to clear out my calendar. I know how much time is gonna take up to do my investigation, to go out in person to the hospital and talk to the hospital staff. And it's important because also the social worker is going to be in all of the spaces that attorneys are usually not welcomed in. Like at the hospital social worker is not going to talk to the attorneys. The ACS worker is not going to talk to the attorney. And it's so important that we send someone out, that I go to the hospital and speak to the hospital social worker, to the nurses, and hear what they know. What did the client say? How is the client interacting with the child? What do they think happened? You know, what if any prognosis have they come up with? What treatment are they giving the child? Because oftentimes attorneys have to wait to hear that information. So if I can go and get that information and get records immediately so that we can start building our theory and building our case, yeah, that's what we do.
Okay, so in terms of the case example, legal strategy, you know, in this case, our legal strategy was reunification, right? Our client we believed that he accidentally caused the rib fractures by doing the CPR, okay, when trying to resuscitate his daughter, or possibly that the rib fractures occurred at somebody else's home because they couldn't be properly dated, okay? So our client's goal was reunification. We knew we were going to ask for an emergency hearing for our client to be reunified with her daughter. So what could we do in the meantime? Client wanted visits with his daughter. So Maggie's goals were, as she just said, to develop the relationship with the hospital staff, develop a relationship with the worker, so I could get information for cross-examination at my hearing. Her notes are going right into my cross-examination. I remember on this case, she was like, got it, cool, got the petition, hung up, called the worker, okay? And got me lots of information from the worker that I could use the next day. So, it was absolutely critical, though, that she knew sort of what I wanted and what kind of information. And of course, the same time, when Maggie needs things for the client, she'll say to me, it's not working with my out-of-court advocacy. I need you to go to legal. Okay? It's not uncommon for Maggie or other social workers we have to say, listen, I've done everything we can. I need you to file a motion, right? And then I'm filing a motion and I'm sending it to her to read to make sure that everything I put in there is accurate. So that's sort of the cycle of how we work together. Okay, so what we do in all our cases is, and this is sort of a snapshot, but in our medically complex cases, we want to obtain medical records. I want to talk to the staff at the hospital. That usually includes the child abuse pediatrician, but any social worker, nurse, or staff that have had contact with my client and the child, right? Talk to family members, talk to law enforcement. And how does a social worker know what to ask and look for? Well, they know because they're so involved with the case, right? But also, and they're part of the legal team, but I often will email Maggie a list of questions for medical staff or the hospital social worker that I want, right? And Maggie has like set up a meetings with this staff that they would never have with me, being like, I just want to meet with you to get, so my client has a better understanding of what's going on. And in that way, she's writing it all down, or frankly, often live texting it to me, right? And then I'm taking that information and putting it in my cross-examination or a motion. So in this particular case of Mr. A with the rib fractures in the baby.
So with Mr. A, what I did, like as just mentioned, I immediately called the CPS worker. And what I like to do is, even if I know all of the information, I like to ask the worker, I like to play dumb. I like to ask the worker, hey, I just got on this case and I really don't know what's going on, but I know that it involves some kind of like fracture or whatever. So I get the who, what, where, when, how, right, from the worker. Who do you speak to? What do you know? Where are they from? Where did you get that information? What's going on, right? And it usually works. And for the most part, I've had the same ACS worker, and we've been able to build a relationship. So she's really like receptive to when she gets a call from me. My goal during my initial conversation is to get as much information as I can, hear from her, what did our client share with her, what does she think happened, what if she spoke to the child abuse doctor, what are they saying, what do they think, what is their theory in a way, what do they think happened, what do they think could have caused such fractures or injury. I asked them if they set up any meetings with the child abuse doctor or with the medical team that's treating the doctor. And if not, then, you know, let's set up a meeting and let's talk as a team and see like, how do we best move forward, right? I asked her questions of how my client is engaged with her. And in this case, Mr. A is very engaged. She said nothing but great things about Mr. A. I asked her if she went to Mr. A's home, and if so, what did she see? She said nothing but great things. She had went to Mr. A's home. She said Mr. A the same day immediately invited her to her home. And she said great things about the setup and the provisions that Mr. A had for his daughter, which was a crib that turns into a toddler bed, into a full-size bed. Like, she said that she's never in her life, in all her years as a CPS worker, seen such a setup for such a very young father, first-time father. And he did this on his own. So I also ask her for all of the medical doctor's information. If she has it, I immediately ask for the social worker at the hospital's information. And I see if we can set up a meeting with the hospital social worker, sometimes because the social workers at the hospital are a little bit more receptive to releasing information when they see that we're calling together with the worker. That's just a strategy that I use sometimes. Not all the time, because if they don't answer the phone, I honestly just pop up at the hospital with a hit button like, hey, let's talk about it. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I start building the relationship with the CPS worker. I ask her if she made any referrals. If not, then what referrals is she looking to make for the client, and making sure that they are reasonable referrals. And I at times even ask her like, hey, I'll touch base with you. Is it okay with you if I touch base with you when I make a referral, just to see who gets to it first? And like, we'll keep each other in the loop. Usually CPS workers are very receptive when I say that, because it's less work that they have to do. So that is also like a way to like attract them. So
I'm going to talk about hearing prep a little bit. No, but I will say, somebody wrote how it is very hard sometimes to get workers to engage. I can't, Maggie, I think I can say that you've had times where you've had very difficult workers on cases and tried to engage in them. I think we're lucky that we have, this doesn't always work, but we have a policy with ACS as a policy in New York City where they're supposed to engage with our advocates. If they're not, sometimes and we'll talk about this in best practice at the end, sometimes I bring it up with judges, because over time now, especially in the Bronx, at least, the judges have seen that our social workers and advocates really help cases and are critical. So they want them to be involved, but usually the tactic of making their life easier or allowing them to have less work works. So hearing prep. I know sometimes as attorneys, we sort of get siloed alone in our hearing prep and want to work alone and do everything alone or with our co-counsel. And I think we're really missing, you're really missing something if you have a social worker or an advocate and you're not involving them. So I could go on for a long time. We don't have that, but what the conversations Maggie has with people go directly into my cross-examination, literally word for word. And, we know with advocacy and persuading a jurist, details matter, right? Details are the most important thing. Painting a picture of what Mr. A's home looked like when the worker walked into it. So Maggie's asking all of those questions that won't be in the discovery provided to me, right? I might get a discovery that says home is appropriate, right? That's not going to help me. Why is it appropriate? That picture for the judge, and Maggie's asking those questions, right? She's had doctors sit down with her and review x-rays with her, right? Because she goes to the hospital, right? She then gets to see the setup of the hospital room that the worker's seen, that I can then cross-examine the worker on what is the setup in the room? What is my client doing during those visits, right? So that they get a complete picture. It's critical. I love having social workers involved when I'm preparing clients for direct examination. Because they've oftentimes spent time with the client that I haven't, or different time with them. They sometimes know more about the client's life experience than I know. And, I think we all know when we direct clients, they have to be in on the theory for it to be really successful. In order to sell a situation, which in this case, it was going to be that our client was sort of taking responsibility for the fact that he inadvertently caused these rib fractures, they have to be in on it. And Maggie will speak to how she prepared Mr. A for how we were going to talk about these rib fractures. The other thing that they do is they help clients prep for mental health evaluations, especially in these cases where they want you to take responsibility for something that you don't actually know that you did, right? Like there's no explanation for the injury, but they want you to show remorse for an injury that you likely didn't cause, that could have been systemic. So it's very complicated about how clients talk to mental health providers in medically complex cases. And so I like social workers to be involved. And if CPS workers don't have to provide testimony in court, they can help with any cross of a child abuse pediatrician. Oftentimes the child abuse pediatrician or the child abuse pediatrician social worker is willing to talk to it. In most hospitals, the child abuse pediatrician and the child protective team are sort of the repeat players, right? Even the ACS workers. So to the extent that your social worker can sort of ingratiate themselves or get to know them or establish those relationships, it can be really helpful. So sorry, I know we're running out of time, so we'll go real quick. You can do this real quick. Sorry. I think we actually already did this one, so I'm going to go on to the next one.
Yeah.
Okay, you want to talk about this?
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, these cases are very critical and the timing for everything is very important. And, you're going to be your social worker or an advocate is going to be spending a lot of time with this client. So I did get to know Mr. A a lot. I got to know that Mr. A grew up in and out of foster home, in and out of going to jail. His parents had a history of substance use, and that he wasn't very trusting of any white person, right? And I got to know that with spending time with him at the hospital, with going on walks with him, with going to meetings with him, right? Being on the phone with him, and just listening to him just talk, right? So I was able to come back to the team and say, I think that knowing what I know, I think I'm able to talk him through why is it that we might need him to get to this certain place where he doesn't have to admit that he did anything purposely, but it was hard and very hard for him. And he said, I feel like people are accusing me. So we're his legal team. We're here to protect him and we're here to defend him. We cannot do that. It's not okay for him to feel that from us. So I had to name it and say, hey, listen, I know that you have very bad experience, in growing up in foster care, in our foster care, and you've been prosecuted by white people. And there's white people in our legal team, but I want to reassure you and assure you that that is not the case here and that you can trust us. And that we are here to protect you and we're here to prepare you for whenever it is that you do need to testify. And I was able to get through to him and through many, many conversations, because it was more than one conversation, say, that we know, and we assure him that we did not think he did anything purposely, and just assure to him that, we know how much he loved his little girl. We know how much he's willing to do anything for his little girl. And even ACS has said it, him going into services as quickly as he did, him being so proactive in his daughter's medical care at the hospital and things like that. And normalizing what happened, normalizing that he is a 19-year-old first-time dad, and that is okay. No one makes mistakes. There is no handbook on parenting, and it could have happened to anybody, right? And it doesn't mean that he did that purposely. It just means that things happen, and it just so happened that it happened to him, right? So how do we get past it? How do we move forward, right? And having that conversation, we were able to get him to a place where he understood what the theory of the case was, and we were able to help him in conversations that are going to benefit him moving forward. Also what I do is when I put him in any services, I talk to his therapist with him, and I also build a relationship with the therapist and with the service providers in order to get them to craft the letters that we will need to use in our litigation in court.
But I just want to highlight how amazing Maggie is, and how we had reached sort of an impasse with our client, my co-counsels and I, that he didn't want to prep with us. He didn't want to talk about it because he was so depleted on how he was being treated by the system and all the system involvement that he had been forced to be a part of his whole life. And we sort of felt like we couldn't move forward in the case because he was such a key member, of course, of the case. He didn't want to come to court appearances, and it totally made sense. There was a lot of trauma involved, and without Maggie's involvement and ability to sort of reframe and talk to us as lawyers about where he was coming from and how we needed to shift, I don't think that we would have been able to move forward. And I should say it's a constant it's constant. I think Maggie probably talks to him multiple times a week, texts with him, and it's invaluable. So we're going to pass the baton. I just want to quickly say that I think an important part of this is getting judge buy-in and other attorney buy-in to the critical importance of social workers. You know, the judges now, I think in the Bronx, really want our social workers and advocates to be involved. Our social workers come to virtual court, they came to physical court, they go on the record where it's appropriate. Sometimes I ask for court orders that they be involved and notified when there's conferences or meetings, and judges want to do it because they know that things will move forward, right, if our staff are involved. The only thing you want to make sure you're careful of is that social workers can sometimes make reasonable efforts for the agency. Like they'll say, oh, well, we don't need to do, the agency doesn't need to do this because the Bronx Defender's social worker does it. So sometimes we're doing crafty stuff behind the scenes to help our clients that the court doesn't know about because we don't want them to alleviate the need. You know, we want that legal standard to be there. And finally, just best practices. I think Maggie and I work very hard to feel like we're equal, which requires a lot of open communication to make sure that we both feel that way. And I, you know, tell me if you disagree with me, but it's very, having a group text with the client, having periodic meetings. We both have set roles that I can do the in-court stuff. Sometimes she can do the out-of-court stuff, but we're doing all the other stuff together, right? I'm going to get the medical records. She's going to get the medical records if we need to, right? She's going to a conference. I'm going to a conference. I'm going to what I can do, right? We are all the other tasks, we are trying to divide between the two of us to make sure that one person doesn't feel like they're taking on things that aren't, that, you know, there's not like, of course, there's some things only lawyers can do and some things only advocates can do. But other than that, we do share the bulk of the responsibilities. So,
well, thank you. I want to say thank you. We have a lot of questions for you. So we're gonna bring it to Lisa so that Lisa can talk. She's going to distill it down a little bit more about, as a social worker on the team, kind of what her role ends up being when engaging with experts. And I have a lot of questions that we'll get to after Sonja, and we'll see which ones rise to the top over the course of the next two discussions. So Lisa, do you want to start? And thank you so much, Jess and Maggie. I like hearing you guys talk and feeling so confident with each other and comfortable and trusting of each other. I think that's what we want. So thank you.
Yeah, so I can begin. I hope everyone can hear me. So I just wanted to start off. So I'm Lisa. I'm a social worker in the Boston office of the Children and Family Law Division. So just as Jess and Maggie said, I work as part of the agency and I'm part of the multidisciplinary team. So I am part of the legal team, and that is something that we stress to our clients. I find it important to note that I do not testify in cases. That might differ in other places, but we are very adamant about that. And my agency also represents parents and children. So I want to start off by noting that in Massachusetts, attorneys need to submit an ex parte motion for funds and have that approved by the judge before we can go forward with officially hiring an expert. We can do the legwork of finding the expert, but they cannot begin any work until it is officially approved by the courts. So because of this, we have to be really strategic in hiring an expert for our cases. And we need to really consider what type of expert to use and when during the case it would be most helpful. A few other things I just wanted to mention, that our agency, we have a list of vendors or experts that have been approved by our system to accept payment. I know that everyone likes to get paid for their work. So sometimes if we find an expert who's outside of that system, it's not that they don't want to work with us or be approved to get paid, but it can take a long time. And then it can also mean that it takes a long time for them to get paid, which for some people that would deter them, and that makes sense. Also, a lot of the hourly rates are predetermined. So if we're going to hire an expert to do something specific, we have to get an amount that they are requesting and how much time it would take them to complete that evaluation or whatever task they have. So we do have a pool of experts that we typically use, but we want to start to look outside that group of people. We don't want our judges or the other attorneys in the courts to become too used to certain experts and almost expect what they're like, and expect what they're going to say. That's not helpful to our clients, and that's not helpful to our cases. So I wanted to focus on hiring an expert further into a case and how the attorney and I work collaboratively to decide what type of expert to use. So at this point in the case, we understand the concerns that our child welfare agency has, and we can really focus in our expert to make sure that we are addressing what I want to call like these unresolved issues of the case.
Well, I'm going to help Lisa along here a little bit. So when that happens, you're 6-7 months into a case, you're feeling stuck. What are some things you consider and whether to reach out to an expert?
Sure. So I think it's really important, and we're doing this as the case is ongoing, but to review the providers that the client is already working with. And I say this because oftentimes DCF, who is our child welfare agency, will not consider the provider that a client is working with to be qualified in that field, which is incredibly frustrating, but it happens more often than not. So for example, if a client has a history of domestic violence and the client is working with a therapist and working on, issues around domestic violence, but they don't work for a qualified domestic violence agency, we often get pushback like, well, they might be talking about it, but we don't really think that person's qualified to really address those issues with the client. And so again, we want to pinpoint what unresolved issue should be addressed by the expert in order to strengthen our case. Oftentimes our clients can have multiple unresolved issues, and we want to figure out like, okay, well, what's not being addressed and what do we need to prove in order to make reunification happen or to stay away from termination? It's really important to speak to the client in coming up with this plan. They need to feel that they are part of this decision, that they are part of the team, and they need to buy into working with this person. So we'll decide what kind of expert we need to use. So some examples of experts that we've used in the past and I'm currently using are, we have experts that will do a home study to assess a person's home. We have experts that will do a parenting assessment in order to assess a client's parenting capacity and what their ability to parent is. We've used bonding or attachment experts. We've used substance use experts and also toxicologists. And we've done experts that have done neuropsych and psych evals. So in some cases, if we're doing a parenting evaluation, that expert will have to be present at parenting time sessions where the DCF agency is present. So they'll be aware that that evaluation is happening. So you can't really hide that. But other evaluations like a neuropsych or a psych eval, DCF doesn't need to be aware that that's happening. And we also talk to our clients about like, let's keep this between us until we're ready to potentially let everyone else see the evaluation. In certain cases, we've hired professionals to do a psych evaluation and we haven't told DCF. And DCF said that they did not validate the evaluation because they were not allowed to speak to our expert and give their opinion of working with that client. So what we do is we don't want DCF to be speaking to our expert, but we will provide all the documentation of the case. It's really important to remember that the DCF workers, they're not clinicians and they have biases in these cases. And I don't want them, talking into an expert's ear and trying to explain what they think is going on or what they think is happening with a client.
Lisa, I know I had wanted to ask you a little bit more about like what your role is in identifying a good expert to work with, but because of our timing and because that's a more practical intervention and it will differ so much like in every state, how do you find an expert? Like you said, sometimes you have to use a list, of people willing to be your experts who've been approved. And sometimes you have to do independent research, right? And like start from scratch and ask colleagues to help you identify an expert. So I want to ask you about once you and the attorney have landed on an expert who's willing to do the work, approved to do the work, what is your role in working with your client and that expert during the case?
Yeah, sorry, I was like, I blacked out for a second, so I had to skip, totally fine. So I help compile all the material to be sent to the expert and make sure that the expert is staying up to date on the information. I typically, and I do this in collaboration with the attorney. I cannot stress that enough. I'm not, we work together at every step of the way. typically, just as Jess and Maggie said, I often have more communication with our clients, or a different type of communication. Sometimes I can be seen as a little less threatening because I'm a social worker and not an attorney. I mean, for whatever reason. So I do have multiple conversations with the client as to the reason behind hiring our own evaluator and the strategy behind it. I often find that clients are not only much more willing to work with a professional that we've hired, but they feel much more supported in the legal case. So at this point, the case is typically extremely contentious between all the parties, and it often feels at a standstill. And it's really easy for clients to give up. And I feel that when we hire our own evaluator, it almost like kickstarts that motivation again. I also have ongoing conversations with the attorney and the evaluator to discuss the case history, the purpose of the evaluation, and that continues on. In certain cases, I'll be present for the first meeting between our expert and the client. For example, we recently just hired an expert to conduct a neuropsych on a 15-year-old client, and our initial meeting we scheduled over Zoom, but I was able to introduce my client to the expert, and it really helped the evaluator feel more comfortable. It helped my client feel more comfortable, and then it really started it up for success. It's also really important to have regular debrief sessions with the expert to understand several things. So we want to understand where they are in the timeline of the evaluation. Is this taking longer than they thought? Has our client missed some sessions? Where are we? We also want to know, can the expert make any recommendations at this time? Sometimes we'll hear what recommendations they're thinking, and it will completely change our strategy. And it's really important to keep checking in with the expert. We also want to know what, if any, observations that they may have that could impact the direction that we take with that expert. I can give you an example of this. So we recently hired a professional to conduct a psych evaluation for a client. We spoke to him after he met with the client in person, and we were able to speak to him about his observations. He was also able to go to our house, and we've never been. So we kind of learned through him, maybe there wasn't as much furniture as we thought, or maybe the home wasn't set up in the way that we thought it was. He was also able to provide some of his recommendations. So we hired him to do a psych eval, but we were able to get his input on, well, what do you think her parenting ability is? And what supports do you think she needs to parent? So that's incredibly helpful. And Jill, I know we've talked about this, but it's critical to debrief with an expert once the evaluation is over. And if that expert testifies, to also debrief with them after that.
Yeah, that's great. We have a lot of questions for Lisa too. This is so great. I love you guys. I have a lot of questions. I'm going to ask Sonja to talk for a little bit, Lisa, because while Sonja's talking, I'm going to look at the questions and see which ones rise to the top so that you get another chance to answer some of them from what you've said. But I want to make sure Sonja gets her 15 minutes. So I hope that's absolutely okay. It's okay to leave everybody wanting more, which I think is what's going to happen at the end of the session, but that is okay. This is like an ongoing conversation. All right, Sonja.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay? You just not okay, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to try to share my screen. Let's see if we're successful. Okay. So I have a lot of information to share. And so I just want to start by saying, don't be overwhelmed by the slides. I put a lot of information on the slides so that people would have it later to reflect back on. My name is Sonja Ulrich, and I am currently in Olympia, Washington. I've been a social worker for about 29 years, and I have a master's in social work, and I'm currently completing my doctorate, focused my dissertation on the perceptions and practices of caseworkers regarding decision-making at reunification and whether or when to reunify with the family of origin. So I'm hoping to have that done really soon and be able to share that with you maybe at next year's conference. There's some really interesting findings from across the nation. So one of the things that I currently do is I serve as a forensic social worker. So you heard about these different types of social workers, and although I've been in those roles before, my role currently when I have time and when I'm able to do it is a forensic social worker. So it's different than the advocacy role. And so I'm hoping to try to clear some of that as we go through, and hopefully it will connect with some of the things that Lisa just shared about when you find experts. I think we were pretty consistent and didn't even see each other's talking notes either. So, okay. So again, there's a lot of words on the slide. For me, it looks very tiny, so I'm hoping that you can see it. If not, it will be made available. But I just wanted to highlight kind of what is a forensic social worker in child welfare. I think that there is a lot of potential to use a forensic social worker as an objective person to come in and take a look at a case at various parts, various times. I'm going to share some examples of what that might look like and where you might use a forensic social worker. But this role is the role of an expert versus the role of an advocate, meaning we would remain objective, looking at all the information. And sometimes, unfortunately, it doesn't always land in the favor of the client. And so kind of what happens when we get there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Okay, so these are just some of the possible roles of how you could use a forensic social worker. One of the things to tag on to what Lisa, and I'm going to dive into each of these, but one of the things to tag on to what Lisa just mentioned is that the different types of evaluations or things that you can do as a forensic social worker may actually identify additional experts that you can recommend to the legal team that they may want to consider having. For example, I've had cases where I have found the arguments of the state really were in an area that was not my expertise. And so I suggested that they obtain a neuropsychological evaluation as one example in order to help continue to provide the right service. So in some cases, the work actually leads to other recommendations. Okay, so for the first category kind of being case reviews, this is a huge category of potential work that a forensic social worker can do. So these are just things that I've done in the past, things that have come up on different cases. But I want to highlight, because of my dissertation and because of the importance of the subjectivity of a lot of the work that's done by social workers with families, the whole piece about bias and personal perception and decision-making is really, it can help you in all sorts of things, in all sorts of cases, to look at, has a worker actually, has the caseworker actually taken all the evidence into consideration, or have they only sought out and used information that really presents their perspective of the case? And I think that Maggie was kind of talking about that earlier when they were sharing the medically complex case. So if you're not taking all of the medical information and all of the interviews, but you're only taking bits and parts of that, you are using a biased perception as you are looking at decisions. And we find more often than not in looking at these cases from a real objective view, you can actually see that happening as you go through the case. So these are just other types of things that can be done: risk and safety assessments, reviewing their safety assessments, looking at service plans. We've been used to review other experts' professional reports, and we can identify maybe what that expert should have had in order to review the information they did, or we can refute some of their arguments because we tend to know the file a little bit more than perhaps the state experts would have had time to. Some other ideas would be to really take a look at whether or not they've accurately portrayed the situation of the client. Have the services that have been identified, are they the right ones, or are we having a cookie cutter approach to a family with the same types of services required? I do a lot of comparison with statutory regulatory elements because I really think it's important for the judge to see that the federal regulations that require Title IV-E, public child welfare agencies to do certain pieces of work, it's consistent across the nation. Those are things that we can't, it's not dependent on what state that you're in. Those are all consistent across the nation. So it's an easier way to try to identify maybe where there's some practice issues. So I'm not going to dig deep into this, but as I think Lisa mentioned earlier, they hire experts to do home studies. Forensic social workers can do home studies. Often we're called to examine department failed home studies, as they would call them. And at least here in Washington, once they fail, take another look at them. And many times the reasons for failure of the home study are not at all really related to anything that would prevent a permanent plan or family. Often we see these in grandparents with the reason for failure by the department being some health-related issue. Again, not necessarily related to safety. So looking through that real quick. Using a forensic social worker in parent-child visitation and to observe them. I think another key place to use our services is the visitation notes. Most folks don't realize this, but the visitation notes that go into the file are seen, but often families, unless you have a social worker on your case on the defense side, families don't always hear the feedback of what they need to improve on or what they're being judged against. And so they make the common, they're continuing to have the same patterns because they're not being informed of what the department or the observer thinks is inappropriate. Okay, there's a ton on here, specialized individual assessments, but I do want to highlight one particular example on this one, and it's really about the cultural engagement and really looking at race and equity issues for families and looking at the individualized needs of a family. And not too long ago, I had a case where they filed a termination petition on a father who had his children removed, actually not due to any fault of his own, but he spoke a different language because his children were put into a foster home that was non-Spanish speaking and had no concept whatsoever of the culture in which the children would have been raised if they would have been with their parents. The father could not communicate with his children, so the department basically filed a termination petition. However, when the termination trial actually happened, I was able to testify on behalf of that father that they failed to make reasonable efforts to really maintain that parent-child relationship by not ensuring that the parent could actually even communicate with his child. So we did win that case, but that was just one example I wanted to share because it was very successful. I'm going to skip through some of these, and so you'll get a copy of the slides if you're interested. I want to stop at this one in terms of trial support and preparation. I want to be really clear that all those other things I talked about are really objective roles for the forensic social worker, but there are times when we can't exactly give you what you need in a case. And in that situation, one of the other services we can switch to is to help support you in trial and preparation by helping with questions, helping with interrogatories, depositions, those sorts of things. You can't have both roles. You can have one or the other. So just, it sometimes is an option. And these are just different ways, different elements that workers can testify to, or forensic social workers. Again, I'm going to skip forward. Okay, because I think this is what I was supposed to really hit this. 15 minutes goes by so fast. So I was asked, what do you need to know if you're going to have the first meeting with the forensic social worker? So I tried to do some do's and don'ts. These are just based on what's happened to me in the past. And so one of the things I just want to highlight is I think often attorneys who wholeheartedly believe in their client, which is wonderful, and everyone needs someone to believe in them, sometimes feel like I think it's their job to present only the positive perspective of their client. And I just want to point that out, that it doesn't do the client any favors, because if we're doing our job correctly, we are gonna find the faults, and it doesn't mean that we can't support it. It just means it feels more like a deceptive relationship, like I've only received part of the information rather than the whole perspective. I think it's also important to share the overview, especially if there's potentially trauma issues, or there's something that could be triggering in the file. It's important to let the forensic social worker know that. Don't let us run into it like a brick wall. I had that situation happen before, and it's kind of shocking because it was so significant. You were kind of wondering why they didn't mention it. So I actually thought that the attorney didn't know And when I contacted the attorney to say, I think we really need to talk about this really traumatic thing that happened, they're like, oh, well, what if I told you it didn't quite happen that way, right? So it was really, it was a challenging situation. So these are some do's and don'ts. Try to have a sense of what you're looking for, what your hope is. Just because you have it doesn't mean you get to give it, but it's kind of a guessing game to wonder, what is it that you really want me to do? And what is it that you're hoping that I can do? And then we can sort that out later. So I think the other thing is don't expect availability with really little notice. I think I've had people call and ask for, they have a trial tomorrow and they have, 7,000 pages of, no, it's not going to happen. So anyway, those are just some do's and don'ts in the first meeting. Let's see, I think I was asked to talk about what do I consider whether or not I take a case. The first one, is it a good fit? Is this my area of expertise? And if not, I have a list, just like Lisa has a list. And I will refer to other people who I think may be stronger in that area. I try to balance it with, again, the hope. Can I reasonably look at this and make that determination? Am I the right person to do it? And do I have time given your schedule as well? This is just a list of things, what is needed to begin the case. Don't forget to, give me your client's contact information. And as Lisa mentioned earlier, it sounds like she does this for her clients, but communicate with the client about who I am and what my role is. I've had clients hang up on me often, and I've had to call back and convince them I'm not a state social worker, but I was hired by their attorney. And so that can become a challenge. And I think making sure that, that we're updated on a regular basis when something happens. I have literally shown up to Zoom court and sat there for like an hour waiting, and nobody's responded to my text, and court had been settled. So it was really frustrating. Okay, here's some relationship tips. I was supposed to do this too. Try to respect the boundaries of the forensic social worker to maintain objectivity. That means there's going to be times when we can't completely, say that your client, the family should be reunified or whatever it is that your hope is, but we can recommend services. And so be open to doing that, because the ultimate goal is to make sure that the family situation is remedied to allow the child to return home safely. Take the time to prepare us for a hearing. Try to make sure we know what it is you're going to ask, so that we're prepared and, thoroughly understand the exhibits you're going to use in the court. Make sure that we've studied them before, and update us on major changes that are happening. I think those are kind of the important ones. So 2 more slides. Okay. And yeah, and this last one, I think one of the things that I do when I'm ready to make a determination on a case is I will have a verbal conversation with the attorney and let them know what my findings would be if I were to write them. I do not write anything until we've had that conversation, because sometimes it is a risk for the attorney and the client if they know that they're going to put me on the stand and I may have to support the state's position in a particular area. So I try to be very transparent about what those are. If it's decided that, yes, go ahead and draft the report, I do send the report to the attorney for review. And I always indicate that it's for a factual review, because usually these are thousands and thousands of pages, and I may have gotten something wrong. But I've often had attorneys who have tried to convince me to take things out that they feel did not paint their client in a good light. And I don't think that that's a fair ask. Because if it's a reality of the situation, it's the reality of the situation. And I think that you actually end up appearing to be more skewed and biased rather than maintaining objectivity by doing that. So anyway, I just, that was a lot, but I know we're going to run low on time. So there's my contact information. Yeah.
Thank you, Sonja. I mean, I think there's questions for everybody. I think I'm coming through on Sonja's. Can you mute? You're muted. Okay. Okay. So I think people, going back to Jess and Maggie's discussion, I know that Jess and Maggie have figured out a way to get CPS workers to talk to them or to talk to Maggie. But we know that that's not universal. And there could be jurisdictions anywhere where the counsel for caseworkers doesn't permit them to be discussing the allegations with you. Do you have any thoughts for people who have social workers, right, and have teams where they don't get as much information as quickly from these folks? Any tips for how to get it? Have you ever been shot down but then came back and still got the information? Any tips for folks?
I think I'll let Maggie speak to how she gets social workers at hospitals and CPS to talk to her.
Yeah, so I think the best thing is to try to find another ally if like that social worker won't talk to you, and try to get the information from somewhere else in the hospital. I found very helpful having the client just set up a meeting with the social worker where then I'm there and I'm getting the questions that I need answered. Another thing is, if that doesn't work, is prep the client with the questions that you need answered, so that that client is taking the lead on those conversations, and that the client is asking the social worker the questions that you need answered. And she can't not talk to the client. That's the patient's parent.
Point, Maggie. And I recall being with a parent in the hospital trying to get information, and having a parent going with them to the records department like in the moment, and having my client sign a release for her records, especially like if she had just given birth. And sometimes you could talk the records people into giving you records, printing them out and giving them, because it's the patient's records. And then you get more information, you get social worker notes, and you get all the contact information for who talked to your client. And sometimes it's like the nurse's aide who ends up chatting with you because she happened to be there while everything was going down. So I think it's really about that like investigation and not giving up. And I think that's so great and can be super helpful.
I just also want to add that we build our resources and we write things down, right? So we deal with the same 4 or 5 hospitals. So we now have it written out who you go to, where you go when you want to go to Montefiore to get records, who you talk to, right? Like we're trying to make friends, write down their name and number, and go to that person next time. The value of that is critical. I just want to say of developing those relationships, because we don't subpoena records at first, we get them ourselves. I know someone had that question.
At one of the hospitals, I even sent the records lady flowers as thank you. And like, she called me and she's like, whenever you need anything. So it's like, I'm building friends. That's how you do it.
That's awesome. Lisa, have you gotten pushback from Child Welfare Agency about some of your experts? So you talked about, like, for example, somebody who observes visits and maybe is going to testify about the quality of attachment or whatever. Anytime, are they fighting against those experts for you? And how are you making sure that they're solid so that that information is getting to the court or getting to the other people?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. We've had pushback on our experts. One I can think of in particular, we actually had pushback in the middle of trial as we were trying to get her qualified as an expert. And the DCF attorney was like, absolutely not. I don't think she's qualified to talk about parenting or bonding or attachment. The judge eventually allowed her in, but then we realized her testimony wasn't as strong as maybe we thought it was going to be. So we do get pushback, and we learn and we go to certain people. And then I know someone wrote a question about debriefing. So in that case, the debrief was essential, because then we decided maybe this expert we're not going to use if we know the case is going to trial. And because she wasn't as comfortable testifying, and it was very different from our conversations with her.
I like that you raised the issue about debriefing, and I'm sure Sonja feels strongly about that. I find that debriefing with your expert makes your next case go a lot more smoothly. And also, if you care about your colleagues, if there's some feedback that you can give an expert or an expert can give you so that they feel more prepared, then that's something that makes that expert stronger. And then maybe if you have a colleague who wants to use that expert, they have an expert that's more prepared, and that could go well. And if it didn't go well, then you have to share that information as well, so that we don't use the same experts that are not successful. But Sonja, what does debriefing with you mean, and like how does it help you?
Sure. I put in the slides, I think it's a reciprocal debriefing, where I want to know what worked well, what didn't work well. And I also want to be able to have that feedback because many times if something didn't go well, it was probably due to some kind of lack of communication or something that was entered late. How could we have avoided that in the future? How could we not do that again? But I think most of it's really helpful because it's helping to understand the different courts. I work in a lot of different states, and so I think that part's helpful. And often I work for the state as well as the defense. So I have worked for both. So then it makes it more difficult for the others to not qualify me if they want me qualified in their case. So it's been interesting because the state has actually called me on cases because I was their defense. I worked for the defense. But it actually has made defense cases stronger, as what the defense attorneys have told me. As they move forward, because they recognize there's sometimes when I will be up against a different expert on the defense case. But anyway, it's helpful to understand how the dynamics work within that particular court and what would have been more helpful or appealed to that particular judge or commissioner.
The number one question is such a doozy that I worry about opening Pandora's box. I'm pretty sure that everybody on this call operates, or all the presenters operate in agencies where we try really hard to avoid our social workers being in a position where they would ever need to testify or be experts. And it is something that, we talk a lot about amongst ourselves and with colleagues across the state. And so we did decide that our next ABA webinar would focus on this topic. What are the pros and cons of having social workers on your legal defense teams also be able to testify? Because some places do permit that to happen. I can tell you that in Colorado, we have a strict policy that our social workers on teams don't testify, which would include, of course, a social worker could go to a home and assess the home with their client, and that could inform the strategy for, requesting a return home or unsupervised visits in the home. However, when it comes to something like having to testify about the state of a home or fighting against a home study that was rejected by the Department of Human Services, at least in Colorado, we would seek an outside expert, an outside social worker, to do that so that person could testify and be cross-examined without divulging any privileged information. But I do know that is not the only way to do it. And, I look forward to hearing different models of being able to do that. Lisa, have you ever been, asked to testify, or have you ever been subpoenaed to testify? You too, Maggie. I don't know if that's happened to you. Pretty sure the wrath of the Bronx defenders would fall very, very physically difficult onto those city attorneys. But what about you, Lisa?
So I've been in this role for about 5 years, and it hasn't happened to me. It has happened to my coworker. It is kind of an understanding that we are part of the team, and the DCF attorneys are aware of it. And I know that it was talked about before, but we are often seen as helpful, believe it or not. And that, why push back on someone who's going to help or make communication with the client easier? I often, say that my role is behind the scenes. So that's what I'm doing. I'm talking to clients in private communication and just working them and helping them through different meetings and such. But it hasn't happened to me yet. And when it does, I will not be ready. But I have a very strong agency that will support me when that does happen.
Haley has a question about how you find a forensic social worker. Sonja, how did people find you? Because this is obviously different across the country. Sometimes you have an agency that will help you find your expert, right? You could say to your supervisor or to the director of legal work in your office, can you help me find the right expert? But a lot of people are just out there on their own, having to figure it out on their own. So any thoughts about that, Sonja?
Well, yeah, it seems like the way that people have found me has been through either other cases or other referrals. I think I've also asked, there is apparently an attorney listserv, at least here in Washington. I don't know how far it goes. Often asking them who they use. That's another way to find out. There is the National Organization for Forensic Social Workers, and they also have some lists of people. That it's in all types of law, not just child welfare. as well as NASW has a list that we can access too. So sometimes it's who you know, and it's connections like the ABA that can keep us all together and try to share information. So
I agree. I've asked on our listserv for the ABA to suggest experts and have gotten good leads. I'm happy to talk to people about good leads as well. And I think that is all we have time for, but I want to say thank you so much. I think we could probably have had Jess and Maggie, Lisa and Sonja spend an hour each talking, and we would really have enjoyed that. So we'll leave it here. We'll leave you wanting more. Ask questions, reach out to us. We'll see you through the hallways as we get through the next, half a day of conferencing. And we look forward to seeing you in person someday. But thank you for joining us.